Okay, now let me switch over to U.S.-China relationship.
Yeah.
President Trump is scheduled to travel to China next month.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I think you're absolutely correct. This upcoming meeting is incredibly important, and everyone is watching to see what happens between the two leaders. Both of these leaders enjoy enormous power in their respective systems and are able to dictate largely individually what outcomes they'd like to see. President Trump appears quite focused on short-term commercial and economic goals, whether it's the large purchases of agricultural products, whether it's potential deals in relation to beef or Boeing jets. Those are the kinds of things that appear to be top of mind for President Trump. He's also interested in the possibility of Chinese investment in the United States. And I think he does believe that it is possible to have a better relationship between the United States and China. I think the Chinese are looking for bigger fish. I think they are interested in some relief with respect to certain technology and protocols. I think they would like to see certain of the tariffs eased or lifted, and I agree with you. I think they have ambitions when it comes to Taiwan, and I've heard, and we've had discussions around the very same things about whether U.S. policy will be adjusted to focus on opposing directly Taiwanese independence, and whether the president might go further and encourage the two sides to meet. We just don't know, but we do believe that the issue of Taiwan figures prominently in why President Xi wants President Trump to visit. Let's remember, guys, how unusual it is to the very idea of the president traveling during a period of pretty intense uncertainty, conflict in the Middle East. But it is also unusual that the Chinese are comfortable hosting him. And that suggests that they have a plan, they have ideas about how they'd like to conduct themselves and what they'd like to accomplish in these meetings with President Trump.
What kind of discussions do you expect on the side?
Yes, thank you. So again, I think one of the reasons why the president wants larger purchases for soybeans, sorghum, rice, wheat, corn, exotic nuts, almonds, pecans, is that these agricultural markets have largely dried up, or at least gotten much smaller over the last 10 or 15 years because of rising tensions in U.S.-China relations. And many of the purchases that China makes of agricultural products come from Latin and South America rather than the United States. And President Trump wants to reclaim some of those market share. But it is also the case that issues associated with rare earths, rare earth magnets, will be a topic of conversation. The United States is taking desperate steps to try to relieve some of the over-reliance that U.S. industry has on critical minerals, of which China has a virtual stranglehold. But that process of diversification will take years, if not decades. And so I think the president will be seeking assurances from China that they will not utilize their advantages in rare earths and critical minerals to punish either the United States or other corresponding states in the international order. The Chinese have made clear that in certain circumstances they are prepared to use these advantages. But I think President Trump will at least seek some assurances about China not using them in full force going forward against the United States and others.
How do you expect China to behave under such circumstances?
Yeah, thank you.
In response, what kind of agreement do you think the United States will seek?
I believe that the United States has urged China to weigh in behind the scenes with both Pakistan and Iran with respect to the course of diplomacy. I think the United States has urged China to seek an end to the conflict and for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And I think President Xi, in careful language, has basically underscored this point in conversations with interlocutors from the Gulf itself. China has been careful not to get bogged down in political quicksand in the Gulf, but they have weighed in about easing some of the energy shortages that are now beginning to sweep through Asia. China has substantial reserves, but other countries in Asia like Indonesia, Philippines, others, even Northeast Asian economies, have certain areas of vulnerability, whether it's fertilizer or jet fuel. And I think the Chinese know that, and they are seeking to basically turn some of the heat down and to see a return to more normal relations. I'm not sure how much ultimately influence China has over Iran. They have some, but Iran is its own actor and is going to be prepared to take steps accordingly. I think the point that you made about what happens to U.S. standing if this continues on is a very important one. First, what does it do to the president's core supporters, many of whom have been reluctant to consider other military operations in the Middle East? President Trump famously ran against more forever wars and, frankly, the very kind of military operation that we've seen against Iran. And so there is some electoral implications that could be quite negative for President Trump and the Republican Party. It is also the case that some of the capabilities that have been necessarily used because of this decision to go to war in the Persian Gulf have come from the Indo-Pacific. And one wonders, first of all, how quickly some of those capacities, Marine Expeditionary Unit, naval forces, some fighter aircraft, anti-ballistic missile capabilities, how soon some of those capacities will go back to the Indo-Pacific. And also, we have torn through many of our reserves of certain kinds of long-range strike capabilities, and that also affects the quality of our deterrence. And so I think Japanese friends are looking carefully at what are the implications of the standing of the United States in Asia if this continues. And I think the most worrisome thing is that the scarcest resource inside the U.S. government is the time and attention of senior-most officials. And I can say in this environment, the developments and drama of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf dominate everything. And as a result, perhaps not as much focus on what I believe to be the urgent issues of the 21st century, which are playing out in the Indo-Pacific. I do want to underscore that even though this is a regional conflict in and around the Persian Gulf against Iran, it has very much global implications in a way, frankly, that neither Iraq or Afghanistan had. And so this is a major conflict with substantial secondary and tertiary implications for every country in the region, every country in the world, but particularly in the Indo-Pacific.
The national intelligence concept. Oh, that could be an equivalent to the case in the CIA or something
Yeah.
like that. US
So, yeah. Well, look, as a close ally, I, for one, and I think many others, like our friend Mike Green, have full confidence and support and fully support our partners in Japan. My own sense is the removal of the so-called three no's was overdue, and that Japan, as a normal nation, should be able to have closer security partnerships with others in the region and elsewhere. And so I looked at the decision, for instance, for Australia to embark on a major project with Japan on frigates as a positive sign. This is another indication of middle powers, like-minded middle states, democracies in the Indo-Pacific working ever more closely together. So I support that. I think that's important. I think Japan will be careful about the kind of arms that it provides, and will have a rigorous process to ensure that these capabilities do not end up in the hands of actors that are taking steps that are antithetical to Japan's interests. Look, Japan has taken steps slowly to build an intelligence capacity over the last few decades. I think this is a natural progression, and I think we can help substantially to help Japan set up that institution. The last decade was really about two different bureaucratic innovations in Japan. One was the establishment of the national security apparatus in the Prime Minister's office. I think that step helped smooth coordination and played an important role in diplomacy with the United States and other countries. So I think that was a powerful institutional innovation that was important. And Japan also elevated the role of the what was once called JDA, Japan Defense Agency, to a ministry. And the reason that's important is that they are more able then to determine elements of their budget. And so these are logical, clear-headed steps that have been undertaken after substantial debate and discussion in Japan. And I think the United States, I for one, certainly fully support these innovations in Japan.
So recently, leaders from countries like France, South Korea, Canada, United Kingdom, Germany have visited China.
So I think what you've described is accurate. There are a number of nations that are seeking to rebuild, at least modestly, some of their ties with Beijing, at the same time that they are taking simultaneously steps to build up their military to work with allies and partners. This suggests that some of the most interesting diplomacy that's being undertaken on the global stage now is being undertaken by middle powers. And they have more influence, more sway, more options and opportunity now than they did, for instance, during the Cold War. So countries like Japan and Australia and others play a critical role during this period. And it is not surprising that they are seeking, where possible, to have closer relations with China. But there are limits to that diplomacy, and we've seen that quite clearly. I think the Prime Minister has indicated her desire to rebuild relations with China, and I think she's made that clear in a highly responsible way. But she's also made clear that you know, to do effective diplomacy, you have to be met halfway. And China has, I think, in many respects, sought to turn Japan into a kind of scapegoat right now, a very harsh public diplomacy campaign against Japan. And I think Daikichi, to her credit, has held firm during this period. She would like to resume and rebuild relations, but she realizes that it's difficult to do under a set of circumstances where you're facing daily pressure from China in the media and elsewhere.